I work at a bookstore. Nothing fancy. One of those small, independent places tucked between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner in the older part of downtown. I've been there about 3 years. I like the quiet. I like that nobody really bothers you when you're shelving in the back. I'm the kind of person who never wanted to be noticed in the first place, which is part of why this whole thing took me so long to recognize for what it was. I'm 26. I live alone in the upstairs unit of a converted Victorian, about a 15-minute walk from work. There's a couple downstairs who keep to themselves. I almost never see them. To get to my place, you go up a side staircase that runs along the outside of the house. The door at the top opens straight into my kitchen. There's a window in there that faces a flat section of porch roof. It's important you remember that window. The man's name was Daniel. At least that's what he told me. I don't know if it was real anymore. He started coming into the bookstore a couple of years back. He was probably 40, 42. Tall, thin, neat haircut. The kind of guy who looked like he taught at a community college somewhere. He wore button-up shirts with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and these little reading glasses he'd push up on his head when he wanted to look at something properly. He was nice. That's the part I have to keep saying because it's the part that messes with me the most. He was actually nice, or whatever counts for nice when you're the person being targeted. Polite, quiet. He'd ask my opinion on a book and actually listen to my answer, and then he'd buy what I recommended. It was small things at first. He noticed when I changed my hair. He remembered I'd mentioned liking a particular author. 3 weeks later, he came in with a hardback first edition of one of her older novels and said he'd seen it at an estate sale and thought of me. Didn't make it weird. Just slid it across the counter and said, "Happy late birthday." My birthday wasn't until April. This was September. I should have clocked that. I didn't. He started timing his visits to my shifts. I work Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and every other Saturday. At some point, I noticed he only ever came in on those days. When I pointed it out, joking, you're like clockwork, he laughed and said he had to time his visits because the recommendations were better when I was on. I felt flattered. That's the part I hate. I felt flattered. It shifted slowly. He started staying longer. He'd come in around 4, browse for 40 minutes, bring something to the counter, then keep talking for another half hour while I rang out other customers around him. He stopped buying as much. He'd hold a book in his hand the whole time we talked, then put it back when he left. The book was just a prop. He started asking questions that weren't bookstore questions. What part of town do you live in? Do you walk to work? Do you live with anyone? I gave him vague answers, kind of midtown. Sometimes I walk. I keep to myself. He didn't push. He just nodded and smiled and asked something else. One Friday in November, he asked me out for coffee. The bookstore closes at 8. He waited until the last customer was gone, until I was locking the front. He was outside on the sidewalk pretending to look at his phone. He said it casually. "There's a place a block over. Do you want to grab a quick coffee?" I said no. I said it gently, with a smile, the way I'd said no to 100 customers about 100 small things. I have plans. Maybe another time. The kind of soft no that's clearly a no. His face changed, just for a half second, and then it was back to the warm smile. He said no problem. Of course. Didn't mean to put me on the spot. He said goodnight and walked off. I stood at the door watching him until he turned the corner. I didn't know why. Something about that half second. I went home and tried to forget about it. I told myself I was being paranoid. He'd been a perfect gentleman for almost a year. One awkward moment didn't undo that. After that night, things in my apartment started feeling different. It sounds insane when you say it out loud, but I'd come home and the air in my place would feel disturbed. I don't know how else to put it, like someone had been moving around in there and the room hadn't fully resettled yet. There was nothing missing, nothing visibly out of place. I checked the door, always locked. I checked the windows, all shut, but I'd noticed things that weren't quite right. The bedroom door slightly more open than I usually leave it. A book on my nightstand pushed back about half an inch from the edge. The curtain in the kitchen window, the one that faces the porch roof, pulled to one side instead of straight. Tiny things. The kind of thing you'd never notice if you weren't already on edge. I started taking phone pictures before I left for work. The bedroom, the kitchen, the curtain, the bookshelf. I'd compare them when I got home. Most of the time, everything was identical. Sometimes it wasn't. The book really had moved. The curtain really had shifted. I started sleeping with my phone in my hand. even though I lived alone. And I started waking up tired. That was the strangest part. I was getting full nights of sleep, 8, 9 hours, and waking up exhausted, foggy, sandbagged. I'd come out of dreams that felt unusually vivid and unusually long. In the dreams, someone was talking to me. I never saw a face. I could just hear a voice, calm, low, kind of male, telling me things I couldn't quite remember once I was awake. Sometimes I'd wake up with a phrase still in my head and lose it within seconds of opening my eyes, the way most dreams go. I told my friend Kim about it over brunch. She laughed and said it was probably stress. She said her sister used to dream about her own grandfather giving her cooking instructions. Brains do weird things. I agreed. We changed the subject. Then in February, I saw him outside my building. I was coming home from work. It was a Tuesday, around 9. The streetlight on my block has been broken since I moved in, so the only light comes from porch fixtures along the sidewalk. I came up the block and looked up at my staircase like I always do. Habit. And at the top, near my door, someone was standing. I stopped. Whoever it was stepped back into the shadow before I could see clearly. By the time I crossed the street, there was nobody there. I went up the stairs slowly. The door was locked. The kitchen looked normal. I stood inside with my back against the door for probably 5 minutes before I could move. The next morning, Daniel was at the bookstore at 10. I'd never seen him there that early. He smiled at me, asked how I was sleeping. I had never told him I'd been having trouble sleeping. After he left, I sat in the back room and cried for about 10 minutes. Then I called my mom and asked if I could come stay with her for a while. I told her some guy from the bookstore was making me uncomfortable. I didn't even know how to explain it. I went home that night to pack a bag. The walk from work felt 3 times as long as usual. Every car that drove past me, I flinched. When I got to my building, I went up the stairs 2 at a time and locked myself in. I told myself I'd be out of there in an hour. I just had to grab a few things. I packed clothes. I packed my laptop. I went into the bedroom to grab my charger, and that's when I noticed it. There was a single dark hair lying on my pillow. Not mine. Mine is light brown and longer. This one was short, black, about 1 inch. I didn't sleep there that night. I don't think I've fully slept anywhere since. I went to my mother's. The next morning I called the police and I called my landlord. The police were fine. They took the report seriously enough. They said they'd talk to him. I gave them the bookstore. I gave them the name he'd given me, his rough description. I told them about the apartment too, the curtain, the moved book, the hair on the pillow, and watched the officer write it down without quite looking at me. They told me to keep records of any contact. Don't change my routine yet. Document everything. What broke it open wasn't me, though. It was a woman who lived in the unit 2 buildings down from mine. She came home from a work trip on a Thursday, and her front door was unlocked. Nothing missing, just the door unlocked, and the dust on her bedroom floor disturbed in a long oval shape next to her bed. Like someone had been lying there for a while. She called the police. They started looking at break-ins in the neighborhood that hadn't involved theft. There were 6. Mine was one of them, even though I'd never officially reported a break-in because nothing had ever been missing. They identified him from my description. Daniel wasn't his real first name. The last name he'd given me wasn't his either. He didn't teach at any community college. He didn't work anywhere they could find. He was renting a basement room from a guy who almost never saw him. When the police searched the room, they found what they found. The detective who walked me through it was careful with how she said it. She sat across from me in a small room at the station and watched my face the whole time. In that way, you can tell someone is watching for a specific reaction. He had recording equipment, 2 small digital recorders, the kind people use for interviews, a hard drive. The hard drive had folders on it sorted by date, not just my apartment. 6 folders, 1 for each woman. Each folder had hours and hours of audio inside it. The detective wouldn't let me listen to mine. She told me what was on it instead. The recordings were of me sleeping. Hours of them. Some were over 4 hours long. He'd been coming into my apartment at night, usually between 2 and 4 in the morning, and he'd kneel next to my bed and turn the recorder on. The microphone picked up my breathing. It picked up the room. It also picked up him. He whispered to me the entire time, for hours, with his face, based on the audio levels, inches from my ear. He said my name. He said other things. The detective told me he repeated phrases, almost like he was trying to get me to say something back in my sleep. He said the same 5 or 6 lines over and over across the recordings. Things like, "Good girl." Things like, "I'm right here." Things like, "You know me." The detective asked me if I'd ever had unusual dreams. I told her yes. She nodded and looked at her notes. She said all 6 of us had said yes. I've thought about that for a year and a half. Those dreams I'd had, the ones where someone was telling me things I couldn't remember when I woke up. Those weren't dreams. He had been narrating directly into my ear while I slept. My brain had been processing his voice as dream material, because that was the only place it had to put the input. He had been training my sleeping mind to know him. For months, I had been hearing him every single night, and not knowing it. I had been letting him in. There's one detail the detective gave me that I haven't been able to shake. She said the audio engineer who reviewed the recordings noticed that on a couple of nights, 2, maybe 3, my breathing pattern would change about halfway through. It would become more even, quieter, like I was responding to him. Like at some level deep in my sleep, I had started to recognize his voice as a thing that belonged there, like I had stopped flinching from it. That's the part I can't put down. The case is ongoing. He's in custody. I won't be in the same city when it goes to trial. I moved twice in the year after, once because I couldn't sleep in any apartment I'd lived in before, and once because the second place wasn't far enough away. I sleep with the bedroom door locked from the inside. I sleep with a sound machine on. I sleep with a chair under the door handle. I still wake up sometimes around 3 in the morning with the feeling that someone is whispering my name. Sometimes I can almost hear what they're saying just for a second before I'm fully awake. Then it's gone. I tell myself it's memory. I tell myself it's trauma. I tell myself there is no one there. I'm telling myself that right now.